Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Wednesday, March 4th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside is looking beautiful today, with a high of 76.2 degrees and a low of 50.3 degrees. It is certainly a great day to get outside and enjoy the sunshine. Coming up on the show, we will be diving into the latest revelations emerging from an independent investigation conducted within the Diocese of Providence. We are also going to examine why California Democrats are expressing apprehension regarding a potential lockout during their gubernatorial primary election. In addition to these main segments, we will also bring you updates on several other stories making headlines today. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We begin this morning with a story that's been years in the making. Today, Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Neronha released a landmark report detailing decades of child sexual abuse and cover-ups within the Roman Catholic Diocese of Providence. The investigation took 6.5 years to complete. Ethan covers state government and legal affairs for us. Ethan, give us the big picture here. What did investigators find?
Grace, the findings are sweeping and deeply disturbing. According to the Washington Post, investigators determined that for more than 70 years, the diocese engaged in what they call a determined effort to hide scandal rather than protect children. They identified dozens of priests who abused hundreds of children. And even when church officials internally deemed reports credible, they frequently failed to stop the perpetrators.
So the diocese knew about the abuse and let it continue?
That's exactly what the evidence shows. The report documents a pattern where leadership repeatedly moved accused priests to different parishes, schools, or hospitals without ever warning those new communities. As ABC News reports, the diocese consistently prioritized its institutional reputation over the safety of children. Attorney General Neronha called the church's historical response, quote, inadequate, end quote, describing a deeply entrenched culture of self-preservation.
How did this investigation get started in the first place?
It traces back to a landmark 2018 Pennsylvania grand jury report that uncovered more than 1,000 children abused by roughly 300 priests since the 1940s. The Associated Press reports that the Pennsylvania revelations prompted attorneys general across the country to examine their own diocese, and Neronha launched Rhode Island's probe in 2019. This carries particular weight in Rhode Island. According to the Pew Research Center, nearly 40% of residents identify as Catholic, the highest per capita Catholic population in the country.
What kind of access did investigators actually get to church records?
They entered into a memorandum of understanding with the diocese that gave the Attorney General and the Rhode Island State Police access to nearly 70 years of secret diocesan archives. The Providence Journal reports that investigators reviewed an estimated 100,000 internal documents dating back to 1950. They couldn't use a traditional grand jury process because they determined they lacked legal grounds to charge the diocese as a criminal enterprise.
One of the most anticipated pieces of this report is a list of accused priests. How does it differ from what the church has put out on its own?
That's a really critical distinction. Unlike previous lists the diocese compiled using its own hand-picked experts and narrow internal definitions, the Attorney General's appendix was built independently from that exhaustive review of church records. According to Ocean State Media, the state's list contained at least 10 additional names of priests who'd never appeared on the diocese's own credibly accused lists. Those church lists were originally released in 2019 and updated in 2021 and 2023, but they clearly weren't complete.
Were any of these accused priests still working in ministry when investigators found them?
At least one was. Investigators discovered a priest with a history of accusations who was still in active ministry during the probe. When they presented the evidence, the diocese removed the priest and added him to their public list. That finding directly contradicted church leadership's claim that all credibly accused clergy had already been identified.
Did church leaders cooperate with the investigation?
Not fully, and that's one of the more troubling parts. Neronha stated that former Bishop Thomas J. Tobin, who served until his retirement in 2023, and other senior officials refused to meet with or be interviewed by state investigators. The Washington Post reports this refusal undermined the diocese's public claims of full transparency and collaboration. It left real gaps in the investigative record.
Were any criminal charges filed as a result of all this?
Yes, despite statutes of limitations blocking many older cases, 4 priests were indicted during the investigation. John Petrocelli was indicted in November 2020 on multiple counts of child molestation. Edward Kelly faced charges of first-degree sexual assault in May 2021. James Silva was indicted in November 2021, and Kevin Fassett was charged in May 2022 for an assault in the early 1980s. Those represent the direct criminal outcomes, even as the broader report serves mainly as a historical accounting.
How has the diocese responded to all of this?
There's been real friction between the two sides. Back in late January, Nerona gave an exclusive interview to the Providence Journal previewing some findings. The diocese called him a, quote, leaker, end quote, through spokesman Michael Keelock, arguing he'd violated the agreement's confidentiality terms. Church leadership also claimed the report contained, quote, no new cases, end quote, and that its contents were already largely public knowledge.
Why do investigators and advocates say that claim is misleading?
Because while the underlying incidents are historical in nature, the report revealed previously unnamed priests and exposed the Church's refusal to acknowledge certain credible allegations until forced by the state. It also documented exactly how cover-ups worked behind closed doors for 7 decades. The at least 10 previously unlisted priests and the discovery of an actively serving accused priest represent information the diocese had either suppressed or failed to disclose on its own.
What about the current bishop? Has he weighed in?
Bishop Bruce Lewandowski, installed as the 10th Bishop of Providence in May 2025, issued a formal response trying to strike a balance. He apologized to victim survivors for what he called, quote, heinous sins and crimes, end quote, committed by church personnel in past decades. The diocese also pointed to the recent appointment of former Rhode Island State Police Lieutenant Colonel Robert Creamer as Director of Compliance to oversee transparency going forward.
What are survivors and their advocates saying about the report?
It's a mix of validation and frustration. The Survivors Network of those abused by priests, known as SNAP, praised the bravery of survivors who came forward and called the report a significant form of official recognition. But they also criticized the investigation's cooperative framework, arguing the process should have been more transparent from the start. For many survivors, some now elderly, this still represents a long-awaited acknowledgement by the state that what happened to them was real and that the Church failed them deliberately.
Is this expected to drive any changes in Rhode Island law?
There's already momentum at the State House. The most prominent effort is called Annie's Bill, sponsored by Representative Carol McEntee and named after her sister, Dr. Ann Hagen Webb, who advocated for the legislation as a survivor herself. According to the state legislature's website, the bill would let victims sue not only their direct abusers, but also the institutions and individuals who protected them, regardless of statutes of limitations. It would also introduce negligent supervision as grounds for civil liability.
Is there broader legislative support beyond that single bill?
House Speaker K. Joseph Shekarchi and Senate President Valerie Lawson have both expressed commitments to prioritizing child safety and institutional transparency. The proposed fiscal year 2027 state budget includes a domestic violence and sexual assault survivor services fund designed to provide stable funding for survivor advocacy and direct services. Part of the money would come from settlements secured by the Attorney General's office, redirecting financial penalties toward victim support. The report is also expected to fuel broader debate about look-back windows for civil lawsuits and stronger mandatory reporting laws.
Nerona has spoken about how personally this work affected him. What did he share?
He revealed that the investigation's findings had, quote, shaken his faith, end quote, as a Catholic. That's a remarkable admission from the state's top law enforcement officer, and it underscores the personal toll that reviewing decades of abuse and systematic concealment took even on investigators. He's framed the entire report as a, quote, painful retelling, end quote, of a dark chapter, one he believed the state needed to document with thoroughness and permanence.
A significant and painful day for Rhode Island and for survivors across the state. Ethan, thank you for walking us through this.
Thank you, Grace.
We've got a big story out of California this morning, where the Democratic Party is essentially at war with itself over the governor's race. Our reporter Chloe has been tracking this one closely. Chloe, what's going on here?
So just yesterday, Rusty Hicks, the chair of the California Democratic Party, released a public open letter that's being called unprecedented. He's urging lower polling Democratic candidates to drop out of the governor's race before the filing deadline, which is this Friday. His argument is blunt. There are so many Democrats running that they could split the liberal vote and let two Republicans capture the top two spots in the primary.
Wait, two Republicans? How is that even possible in California?
It comes down to California's unusual primary system. Back in 2010, voters approved Proposition 14, which created what's called a top two or jungle primary. Every candidate, regardless of party, runs on a single ballot. Only the top two vote-getters advance to November. So in theory, both finalists could be from the same party while the other party gets completely shut out. The Associated Press, in reporting by political writer Michael R. Blood, notes this has happened before at the congressional level but never statewide for Democrats.
Has it really happened before, though? It sounds almost too bizarre.
It absolutely has. The most famous example is the 2012 race in California's 31st Congressional District. That was a Democratic-leaning seat in San Bernardino, but 4 Democrats split the vote so evenly that 2 Republicans, Gary Miller and Bob Dutton, grabbed both spots. Democrats didn't even have a candidate in November despite having more registered voters. Ballotpedia and Capitol Weekly have documented similar cases in state legislative races too.
So how crowded is the Democratic field right now?
Extremely crowded. At least 9 major Democrats are running. You've got former Congresswoman Katie Porter, Congressman Eric Swalwell, former Health and Human Services Secretary Xavier Becerra, billionaire Tom Steyer, former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, State Superintendent Tony Thurmond, former State Controller Betty Yee, former Assembly Majority Leader Ian Calderon, and San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan. The Los Angeles Times and Cal Matters report, this massive field partly resulted from several high-profile figures deciding not to run. Kamala Harris passed last summer, Senator Alex Padilla passed, and former State Senate Leader Tony Atkins dropped out in September.
And what does the Republican side look like?
That's what makes this so dangerous for Democrats. The Republican field is very consolidated. There are really just 2 major candidates, Steve Hilton, a conservative commentator and former Fox News host, and Chad Bianco, the Riverside County Sheriff. Both are Trump supporters. And, critically, another Republican, tech entrepreneur John Slavitt, withdrew in late February. That concentrated conservative support even further behind just those 2.
So what do the polls actually show?
The numbers are alarming if you're a Democrat. According to surveys from Emerson College, the Public Policy Institute of California, and the Real Clear Politics average compiled as of today, Hilton leads with roughly 15%. Bianco is right behind him at about 14.3%. Then you've got Swalwell at around 12% and Porter at about 11.3%. Steyer sits near 9%. Everyone else is in the low single digits. Undecided voters are still somewhere between 10 and 21% depending on the survey. The bottom line is both Republicans are sitting in first and second place.
So about 60% of California voters lean Democratic, but the vote is just carved up too many ways?
Exactly right. The Washington Post reports that registered Democrats outnumber Republicans by nearly 2-to-1 in California. But when you spread 60% of the electorate across 9 candidates and pack 40% behind just 2, the math flips. Democratic strategist Paul Mitchell of Political Data Inc. ran thousands of simulations using polling, fundraising, and voter registration data. According to his analysis, widely cited by the AP, the Hartford Courant, and ABC 30 Fresno, there's approximately a 25% chance of an all-Republican general election ticket for governor.
25% is not a small number. How are the candidates reacting to Hicks telling them to drop out?
They're furious. Almost universally. CBS News and the Washington Post report that nearly every candidate targeted by the plea responded with outright defiance. The most forceful pushback came from Tony Thurmond. He's Black and Latino, and he posted a video on X within hours accusing the party establishment of, quote, essentially telling every candidate of color to drop out, end quote. He asked pointedly whether Democrats are supposed to be the party that embraces democracy. Then he filed his official candidacy papers the same day, making his defiance crystal clear.
Did anyone else push back that strongly?
Former State Controller Betty Yee also filed her paperwork yesterday, signaling she's not going anywhere. San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan's campaign released a statement saying, quote, voters choose the next governor, not political gatekeepers, end quote. Ian Calderon publicly rejected the plea too. And according to reporting from KPBS, LAist, and the San Francisco Chronicle, the letter actually triggered attacks between Democrats. Villaraigosa's campaign used Hicks, warning to publicly call on Becerra to drop out, citing what they called his lackluster fundraising. Becerra's team pushed back hard, and he announced he'd file his candidacy papers today.
So Hicks' letter basically backfired?
It certainly didn't thin the field. As of this morning, no major Democratic candidate has dropped out. The Los Angeles Times and Courthouse News Service confirm the field remains fully intact heading into Friday's deadline. Hicks succeeded in drawing national attention to the lockout risk, but he completely failed at the actual goal of getting people to withdraw.
What about Governor Newsom? Has he weighed in?
Very carefully. According to the AP, Newsom acknowledged the lockout risk as a, quote, legitimate concern, end quote. But he stopped short of endorsing Hicks' tactic or calling on anyone specific to withdraw. He's not endorsing any candidate in the primary, which reflects how politically sensitive this whole situation is.
There's an interesting irony here, isn't there? Democrats have used this same system to their advantage before.
That's the part that's making some people roll their eyes. In the 2024 Senate primary, Democrat Adam Schiff spent more than $10 million on ads attacking Republican Steve Garvey as too conservative. But as Governing Magazine and Notice have documented, those ads were widely understood as a deliberate strategy to boost Garvey's profile among Republican voters. The goal was to consolidate the GOP vote behind one weak opponent so Schiff could avoid facing a competitive Democrat like Katie Porter or Barbara Lee in November. It worked perfectly. Now, just 2 years later, the same structural dynamic is threatening to work against Democrats. Critics, including several of the lower polling candidates, have pointed out the party was happy to exploit the system when it suited them.
What are the national implications if Democrats really do get locked out?
They're enormous. Hicks warned in his letter that a Republican governor would undermine California's role as a bulwark against President Trump's agenda. But the Hartford Courant and Washington Post also report a potentially bigger concern. Without a Democrat at the top of the November ticket, liberal voter turnout could collapse across the state. California elects a huge number of House members, and Democrats need those competitive suburban districts to have any shot at reclaiming the chamber. Depressed turnout at the top of the ballot could cost them critical seats down ballot. And symbolically, losing the governorship in a state that hasn't had a Republican governor since Arnold Schwarzenegger would be devastating for the party nationally.
So that filing deadline is Friday. What are you watching for between now and then?
Whether any candidate has a change of heart in the next 48 hours. But based on everything we've seen, that looks very unlikely. The San Francisco Chronicle and CalMatters report that all major candidates appear locked in. So the conditions Hicks warned about will almost certainly remain in place heading into the June 2nd primary. At that point, it becomes a question of whether voters themselves consolidate around one or two Democrats, or whether the fragmentation holds and California faces something it's never experienced, a governor's race with no Democrat on the November ballot.
That is a remarkable situation. Chloe, thanks so much for walking us through all of that.
Thank you, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Texas voters headed to the polls on March 3rd. and the results are shaking up the Lone Star State's political landscape in a big way. State Representative James Tellerico has clinched the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate, defeating Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with a platform blending faith-based progressive populism and suburban appeal. On the Republican side, it's anything but settled. Four-term incumbent Senator John Cornyn and Attorney General Ken Paxton are headed to a May 26 runoff after neither crossed the 50% threshold. The spending in this race has been absolutely tech-sized, over $110 million in television ads alone. National Democrats are eyeing November as a rare shot at ending their 30-year losing streak in Texas statewide races, especially if the GOP runoff leaves Republicans more divided than a gerrymandered map. Meanwhile, one of Washington's most recognizable Republican faces got a patch of bad news. Former Navy SEAL turned Congressman Dan Crenshaw lost his primary in Texas's 2nd Congressional District to conservative State Representative Steve Toth by a commanding 18-point margin. Crenshaw was notably the only Texas House Republican who did not receive an endorsement from President Donald Trump, while Toth secured a late boost from Senator Ted Cruz. Analysts say the result reflects a continued rightward shift in the Texas GOP and a rejection of Crenshaw's independent streak, including his acknowledgement of the 2020 election results and support for Ukraine. Mid-decade redistricting also added more of Toth's home turf in Montgomery County to the district, giving him built-in home court advantage. Toth is now heavily favored to win the general election against Democrat Sean Finney. Turning to a developing public health crisis, the Camp East Montana Immigration Detention Facility on the Fort Bliss Army Base in El Paso has been shut down to all visitors and attorneys following a measles outbreak. At least 14 active cases have been confirmed among the facility's population of over 3,000, with another 112 individuals in isolation. The camp, run by Acquisition Logistics LLC under a $1.3 billion contract, won't reopen to physical visits until at least March 19th. Critics say the outbreak, following recent bouts of tuberculosis and COVID-19, is a measurable sign of deteriorating humanitarian conditions, and the closure raises serious due process concerns for thousands of asylum seekers now limited to virtual legal access. Overseas, China's factory sector continues to contract attention for the wrong reasons. The official Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index fell to 49.0 in February, down from 49.3 in January, marking a second consecutive month of contraction. Beijing's National Bureau of Statistics pointed to a seasonal pullback from the extended Spring Festival holiday, though a private survey painted a rosier picture at 52.1, suggesting export-driven firms are weathering the storm. All eyes now turn to the National People's Congress, where Premier Li Qiang is expected to announce a 2026 growth target of around 4.5%. And finally, Elon Musk is set to take the stand Wednesday in a San Francisco federal courtroom, facing former Twitter shareholders in a class action lawsuit. Investors allege Musk deliberately tanked the stock through misleading tweets, including one claiming his $44 billion acquisition was temporarily on hold to negotiate a lower price. Shareholders are seeking up to $1 billion in damages, and the case could set a major precedent for executive liability on social media. Musk's attorneys insist his concerns about fake accounts were genuine. You might say the truth is really on trial here. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.